I want them to be able to go in and say, hey, no, I could do this. I could do this assignment really, really well, but I need my tool to be able to have the same access as everybody else. And what drives me nuts is, it's like cheating. Oh, you're giving them a computer. It's not fair. I don't get to use the computer. And I always point it out to my glasses, right? And I say, great, yeah. So I'm going to walk into this classroom today, and you're going to take me of my glasses. You're going to sit me. There's only a seat in the back of the classroom, and you're going to expect me to perform the exact same work when I can't see the board. Is this cheating? Is putting on my glasses cheating for me? Well, no, it's not cheating. No, it's a tool that I need to have access to the same information as everybody else in this space, right?
Hello everyone, we are Sonia and Nick, and this is Dyslexia Journey. And today we are excited to welcome Patricia Zuccala. She is an educational consultant specializing in language remediation, and she is located in Montreal in Canada. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you both.
Great, we're excited to have you.
So to start with, could you just tell us a little more about your background and, then how you became interested in learning differences?
For sure. So, really my background, I think, is quite different than what most educators, more classroom educators would be. I ended up after my high school and my college going the pathway of psychology. And I think that was a really pivotal point in my career because it, in a big way, it got me interested in how people are different and how we behave differently under similar or the same conditions. And because of that, I ended up working in psychology. I got hired in a very specialized learning clinic that worked with students with dyslexia. And from there, I ended up working in various schools. I worked in a consulting space for 17 schools, but for a nonprofit organization. And then I went back to school, into a school rather, to work as a director in a school. And it became really apparent that I had nobody to recommend that could remediate the language differences, even at my very own school. So it got me thinking that maybe there's a very different way of handling this, and maybe that I have the tools and expertise and the knowledge that really we need as a greater society to fix this literacy crisis across all schools. So that's really what got me started. In terms of what got me started, what got me interested in learning differences, it's I have a very particular, I've been asked this question before, whether it's in an essay or presentation, and it's always this memory that comes back to me. When I was in grade 4, I actually changed schools in grade 3. My parents moved me to quite a different neighborhood, whole new batch of kids. But I was always kind of the good student, right? Literacy always came very easy to me. And I was the new kid. I was in grade 4. So 1 year into this new school with my grade 4 teacher that I love to this day. I still remember her very fondly. There was a boy in my classroom who couldn't manage to read his French book. So we were in an Anglophone school. We're in a bilingual province, of course. We'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But he couldn't quite read his French book. He was lacking the language. He was lacking the understanding of the code to be able to read these very simple books. They were dromadaire books. I'll always remember them. And the teacher asked me, like twice a week after school, would you sit down with him after school and help him read these books? And I, sounded pretty simple enough to me. I said, okay, he lives around the corner from me. Maybe I could do this. But really what sparked it is I remember, and he was kind of the one that he got in trouble a lot in class. He was a bit of the class clown. And clearly because he had some academic difficulties, right? In that one-on-one space together, I started to recognize that he wasn't really interested in these books. But if I made them funny or if I made them interesting in some other way, I could gain his attention long enough for him to actually get something out of the book. So I really learned my first lesson kind of in engagement, and that paying attention to me is the first step. If you're not paying attention to me, forget about it. We're not going to get anywhere, right? So I need to make sure first and foremost that you're listening to me and you're engaged, you're tuned in. And that's really what launched, I think, years later, this this need to kind of repair people's learning skills.
That's so interesting. So how
Yeah.
what grade were you in when you were doing that at that new
What,
school?
sorry, what grade?
Yeah, how old were you, or what grade were you in when you were
This
doing
was grade
that?
4, grade
Grade 4.
4.
That was grade 4. Okay,
Wow,
yeah,
Yeah,
but you
exactly.
that's so interesting to have such a foundational experience that early.
Yeah,
yeah,
and I
and
think that, yeah.
no, go ahead.
I think that it was, I was an only child, so I didn't have a lot of interactions with we had other kids around, of course, but I didn't have kind of that negotiation, that more like I need my brother or sister to do something for me, or to do. So I had to learn that lesson, right? Like, I want him to learn. My teacher has asked him to learn, and I need to make that happen. I felt that sense of responsibility, and it worked. And I mean, I continued to teach him or read the books with him for the rest of the year. And it was a pivotal moment in my career, I assume.
Yeah, I mean that's such an important insight that I think as adults we too often forget that learning should be fun, and that the best way to engage learners is to make it fun. And I wonder if you were able to come to that insight easier because you were still a kid at that time yourself, maybe.
That's a very good point. Maybe if I wouldn't have had that experience so young, because what you're saying, I completely, it resonates with me a lot. I'm that very silly, fun teacher who will, I have clear expectations. Don't get me wrong. You have to like listen to me and I expect certain behaviors from you, but fun and silliness are a big part of the teaching. And I think that in very often, especially when you're dealing with a child who has difficulty in a certain area, making it feel fun and lighthearted is the ticket that they need to buy into what you're selling, right? Because
Right.
if it's going to feel painful, like every classroom feels painful, why am I going to do this again? This hurts, right? Like, it's not fun, and it doesn't work usually. So if it's not fun for me, if I'm not bought into what you're selling, then why am I going to even risk myself getting hurt?
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So you started to talk about how you had that moment of insight that maybe you could, be someone who isn't just the director of school, but maybe is more specialized in this way and providing something that was really necessary out there. Can you tell us a little more about that journey, like how that came to be then, and sort of broadly what you provide in that area?
For sure. I'd been in various kind of school positions. I really started in the clinical kind of therapeutic approach of, I often refer to it as quote unquote teaching the unteachable. And I say that because over and over I've been given these students that they say, now this one will never learn. This one will never learn to read. And over I say, give me the kid, give me a year, give me 2-3 hours a week, and you'll see you won't recognize that child in the next year. I think having been in school systems and working even as a consultant in a nonprofit organization working for schools, there's a lot of red tape and pressure right now in all schools. And I mean, it's a very big reality in our city, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a very big reality province-wide, nationally, and, even between our shared countries. And it became just fighting red tape when really what I wanted to do is improve literacy scores for all students, particularly those who struggle with literacy, right? I had the skills and the knowledge of what I need to do to explicitly teach these kids how to do it, but there's always red tape being met, whether it's budgeting, whether it's dealing with other super prevalent important topics in schools like behavior and anxiety that students are really, really feeling, which is extremely valid. But it didn't take away from the fact that I really wanted to be a part of solving the literacy crisis, right? And I wanted to, and it became evident that instead of fighting all this red tape in school systems, maybe I could really do it myself. I had almost 20 years of experience under my belt really to get this started, and I knew that I had never failed teaching a kid how to read. So it said, you know what, instead of fighting these battles and working a ton of hours in a school system, very often not getting to exercise my passion, what if I remove myself from it and I started offering this service to schools, right? And let me fix your literacy crisis starting with the classroom. Let's teach teachers how to teach phonics in the classroom, and then we'll see that gradually we'll return to the resource room being for that 5 to 10% of students who really struggle with literacy. So I decided to do that. And honestly, it's been 6 months that it's been full-time, just my career, and it's really taken off. I have a lot of connections that I've made over the last 2 decades, and a lot of trust, I think, that's there from parents and educators. And here we are. And honestly, I feel very happy and blessed to be able to say that I'm doing this full-time now. It feels like a dream. Mm.
That's great.
That's
I didn't
fantastic.
realize
Yeah.
how recent it was that you
Yeah.
launched your consulting business.
Full-time, yes. I launched it a year prior, but I was still maintaining a full-time, and then this is what I had to do full-time. So, and we're already growing. I've already hired 1.5 employees, so it's wonderful.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess you talked about, I guess one key aspect of the way that you work with kids is to make things fun, to make, to be silly, things like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to working with dyslexic kids in particular?
Of course.
And, you can take this several different directions. I mean, one, are there particular kind of like you use Orton Gillingham, that kind of thing. And then also just like tips and tricks that you've found super effective for dyslexic kids in particular.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So even bigger, I think, than really the being silly and the giggles, I think that really what that forms is a relationship. And I always say, that the relationship is a very central aspect to language remediation, especially if you're doing it one-on-one. Very often these are students that over and over and over again have been said, this person will help you. And then they're given a person, and then sadly they don't necessarily improve, right? So I think it's just coming in with a very clear, empathetic approach to understanding that this hurts, this is painful. And I always start my sessions with a new student building a relationship. So I want to know, what parts of school do you love? Because when you love something, usually we tend to be pretty good at it. What parts of school do you hate? Because usually when we hate something, it's usually a point of contention. It's a difficult part, right? So having a really understanding, and I see very often students are kind of afraid to tell me, I hate reading English, or I hate writing French, right? Because they don't get that space to really articulate that and say, I hate this. This is not fun for me. And I want to make sure they have that space with me. So they're able to say, I absolutely hate this, but I know I need to improve, so I'm going to work on it. So first things first, I think bigger than the jokey and the comedy aspect, which I think I'm pretty funny personally, but I think it's really a matter of building the relationship. That's foundational. From there, though, I'm always going to do an explicit instruction of phonics, right? So I'm really teaching the relationships between symbols and the sounds that they make depending on the context of each word. So we're not studying words, we're studying sounds. There's only 44 phonemes in English. There's 44 relationships between symbols and sounds. Instead of teaching students 400,000 words in English through 1 year, let's focus on those 44 sounds and think about the excess of language that we're giving a child when we're doing that the right way. So I'm always going to be teaching those relationships while still maintaining that relationship, right? Another very, very important part, another important part also is the use of anchors. So learning anchors are basically another way for the child to have access to what that means, that learning piece means, without it being just random rote memorization, right? So if you're teaching them something, rather than just saying, we put an E at the end of this word just because it's like that, that's it. We put an E at the end of this word and we move on. Let's give them anchors. Let's find out why. Let's group simple words that are similar together, right? Let's give them another route to that learning besides just random rote memorization. And finally, a really important ingredient to my teaching is that every single child has some sort of visual representation of their learning. And I think that this is really the miss in most schools and in most settings of intervention is, they teach them something, and that child in that intervention setting, they're really able to show that they're learning, right? It's working. And then we send that child back home, and perhaps they return to that therapeutic setting a week later, sometimes more, sometimes less. And it seems over and over that people tell me the memory is gone. This child has a memory issue. There's no more, everything we taught last week is gone. That all of that can be solved by just giving a visual representation of the skills that we learned. So any phoneme and grapheme association that we're learning, we're putting it on a folder, we're putting it on a paper, and that becomes their encoding and decoding tool in all environments, whether it's with me, in the classroom, or at home. And that is the constant that gets them to generalize their new learning in many different environments as well.
So what does that look like? I'm not sure if I totally understand.
For
Can you give an
sure. So
example of that?
I make them a duotang, right? And their first page is kind of like in a plasticized paper. And we have an area with the short vowels. So the short vowels, it starts out blank, my paper. Let's say we learn short vowel a today, right? We're going to add a in the short vowel. I'm going to teach them that being a short vowel means you cannot say your name, right? The symbol that looks like A. Sometimes he says A, sometimes he says this sound, but really today we're teaching you that whenever you see this A sound, this A letter, he says a, right? Just like an apple. And so we practice, then we're going to practice words like pat and mat and cat and sat and so on. Once I feel that child has mastered that phoneme, that sound symbol association, we add it to their folder, and then they have learned something that I know next time they return, I will integrate the past learning into what they're learning today. It's kind of like a reference sheet of all the sounds that they've learned. And what I've noticed is at the beginning, students depend on this very heavily for their spelling and reading, right? But gradually, whether they need 500 repetitions for their brain to recognize or 1,000, over time, they start to need this visual representation less and less.
Got it.
Interesting. And do you ever work also for that middle piece you were talking about? Do you ever work on sort of like word origin kind of things for like kinds of things? I mean, that probably would be a little bit older maybe, but I'm curious.
Exactly. No, 100%. So that really, it's funny because I'm kind of, I've been asked from some schools to kind of help them build like my own English curriculum, how I would teach English from the start. And morphology, word origin, etymology are huge. And they answer a lot of those questions that students come up with, right? Well, how come? How come through, though, thought, and tough all have OUGH, but every single one sounds like a different sound? How come? Well, there's reasons behind that. And so I remember the first time a student asked me why said, S-A-I-D, is pronounced said. And I was like, I don't know. Let's look it up, right? Maybe we can find an answer. And then to this day now, I teach that the reason why said is pronounced that way is because it really did used to be pronounced said, like paid. But over time, with it being such a word that we said very often, it changed, it morphed for our mouth to be easier to say. So those answers to those questions are super important for children to continue their pathway into etymology, morphology, and becoming good readers and spellers.
Yeah, and that's always made so much sense to me. But I feel like a lot of people maybe think that's almost like, like it could be too much information, but I think it really is that it gives people a handle on the why, and it doesn't just feel random.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think for some people, they won't necessarily need that, right? And it doesn't mean that we need to explicitly teach the etymology or morphology of every word that exists. But if there's a question, if there's a wonderment there, well, let's look into it. Why not? That's how we learn.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So beyond all these specifics, which, obviously you're giving them this huge foundation and actually reading, what do you see in terms of, because, you talk about that every single student can be successful. And you say that, like people will say this person can't be, and you're like, no, they can. And we definitely agree with you. Are there other factors that you see involved? Like, I don't know how it is in Canada. Are there a lot of accommodations used in schools? Like, what other pieces are mixed in there too to make students successful?
For sure. So I think we have a lot of kind of the formula in place for success. However, in practicality, we're not really applying them properly in the school. So accommodations are very common here. In fact, you don't need to have a diagnosis to get accommodations. You don't need a diagnosis to have an individualized education plan. But it's hard to say whether all the students, parents, and school systems are necessarily using the accommodations the right way. Accommodations are vital for students with dyslexia to be able to see any success. But the foundational skills to have the language skills to begin with, right? So once you're taught explicitly, then we want to give them the computer. A lot of frustration that I get from students and parents is, so my child is dyslexic. We gave them a computer, right? Now they're in grade 4. They still can't read or spell really. So we gave them a computer and they still can't read or spell because any word that they put in the laptop, it's not being recognized by the word processor, which is extremely frustrating because then it says this tool is supposed to solve all my problems. And here I am using said tool and none of my problems are solved. So primarily we need to remove the tools and really do the work of, once they're 70 to 80% accurate in their own spelling on paper and pencil, then we can put that writing into a computer and then the word processor will pick it up. At that point, a computer becomes a crucial tool for success. Of course, we also have the speech to text and the text to speech, which is very important for exam preparation or doing any sort of exams. And for us here in Canada, we're allowed to use that as long as the aim of the learning is not the reading or the spelling, right? So if you're in history class, you can use a text to speech to listen to your text and then use your voice to speak back to the computer. For subjects that are not specifically related to literacy, reading and writing, that is crucially important. Why should we make a dyslexic student sit there and read through an entire science exam or read through an entire history exam when the assignment here is not reading? The assignment is understanding history. The assignment is understanding chemistry or physics or whatever it is we're studying in science, right? So definitely having something that can take that pressure of language away from those students. But even more so, we need to give them extra time. Even more so, I wish we could give more private space. And it is an accommodation, whether it's a quiet space, which means you're sharing it with other people, or a personal space, which means it's a one-on-one. I wish we could do that more because dyslexic kids really need that as well. However, the reality is that the real estate in schools, we don't often have the people and the space to necessarily put every child who struggles on their own to complete any sort of assessment.
Yeah, we talked about that recently in one of our episodes about accommodations. Our daughter, who we talk about often on the show, who has dyslexia and is in high school, when she has extra time on exams, she sometimes ends up just like sitting in the hallway, having to take the test with people walking by and coming up and talking to her. And, it's less than ideal, I guess we should say.
100%. And really, we're giving her something that's supposed to support her, but really to her deficit, right? Because she now has to learn how to manage the distractions better than what they're having to encounter in the classroom. Now, if there's one thing I teach my dyslexic students is nothing will ever be easy for you. So get used to handling these difficult scenarios that are completely unfair, but learn to handle them. The sooner you are, the more successful you'll be right now, right? Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that leads right naturally into our next question, actually, which is about the self-advocacy piece, which it sounds like you, in the course of your work with students, do try to also help them learn, it sounds like.
100%. I think really my goal with a child, when I meet a child and I can tell that the deficit is severe enough that I'll be working with them probably for a couple of years, right? Especially in a space where we do English and French. It's like the double whammy for these poor students. I always want them to recognize that right now I will be there to fight your battles. I will go and speak to administration about you getting a reader and a scribe for that. I will go make sure you have a computer. I will speak to your teachers. I will speak to your parents. But guess what? I'm not always going to be there to be the one to say that. And something I work really, really hard with my students is having not only a sense of understanding of their dyslexia, but a sense of pride about their dyslexia, because there's so much great that comes with dyslexia as well. And I think that it comes in this shameful sort of feeling because we spend our entire days in a school setting where they're evaluating the one thing I'm not good at, right? Like every day I'm being monitored based on my reading and my writing. And so I want them to be able to go in and say, hey, no, I could do this. I could do this assignment really, really well, but I need my tool to be able to have the same access as everybody else. And what drives me nuts is, it's like cheating. Oh, you're giving them a computer. It's not fair. I don't get to use the computer. And I always point it out to my glasses, right? And I say, great, yeah. So I'm going to walk into this classroom today, and you're going to take me of my glasses. You're going to sit me. There's only a seat in the back of the classroom, and you're going to expect me to perform the exact same work when I can't see the board. Is this cheating? Is putting on my glasses cheating for me? Well, no, it's not cheating. No, it's a tool that I need to have access to the same information as everybody else in this space, right? My glasses are this child's computer. So I want them to confidently be able to go into a space, speak to a professor when they're in university, speak to a resource department when they're in college, and be able to say, hey, I have dyslexia. This is what I need to be successful, and the more, and what we really see is when you have the confidence to say that and speak up, you get what you need, right? So this shamed feeling of like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want anybody to know. I completely empathize with that feeling, but I try to coach it out of them, because truly, I also think that these dyslexic kids are the future, right? Like, they're the ones that will solve all our problems down the road. So don't be embarrassed about your challenge with reading.
Yeah. Let's dig into that a little bit more. The strengths of dyslexia. I mean, that's one thing that we on Dyslexia Journey we emphasize a lot, that dyslexia is really it's a brain difference that affects much more than just reading and writing, and many of those effects, and I hate to put sort of ascribe sort of positivity and negativity to things, but many of those effects are, quote, positive.
100%.
So can you tell us some of the sort of strengths that you've observed among dyslexic kids?
There's like too many to name, right? Like, as somebody who's worked with students with dyslexia so long, I'm like the person who says, I wish I was dyslexic, right? Because I see the value and very often it's so implicit that it's hard to even see. But having worked with hundreds and hundreds of students with dyslexia, and especially the ones with the most severe kind of language challenges, right? I've seen that the biggest, besides the obvious, we see a lot, the creativity, the drawing, the painting. Like, I would have the most beautiful pieces of artwork in my offices everywhere, because these students would bring me their own art pieces, and I would blown away. Like, these people will become artists, as well as, related to science or related to history, or just little areas where it's understanding, where it's logic that leads to your learning. There's some of the best professionals in the world are dyslexic, right? They work in some huge capacity being a CEO, which really the across the board that I see all the time is this unbelievable creative problem solving divergent thinking ability for these students, that very often you sit there and you're like, what? This doesn't even make sense. And you realize that they're thinking at a level so much bigger than you that you're not even realizing. And I'll give you a perfect little kind of anecdote to that story. I remember years ago, this was probably 15 years ago, I had a student who was coming to see us. They were unsure. Basically, he had a really hard time with reading. He was able to read, he was able to decode, but he wasn't grasping enough from it. And so they didn't really know what to do. They asked me to do some investigation, figure out where this child really is. And so it was in grade 6, I gave him a short story reading that was kind of made to be a decodable. So it had less unknown phoneme grapheme associations. And it was about Pandora's box, right? It was a short story reiterating Pandora's box. So of course, and you'll forgive me, I don't remember all the details, but the idea was that, all of these things were in the box, and Pandora was not to open this box. And really it was her curiosity. And when she opened the box, that released all of these things. And it was her curiosity that released them. Well, I read him this whole story, and I slowly, and making sure that the language is processed, and I get to the end and I have a few comprehension questions according to my book that I need to ask him. And so the first question is, did these things exist before Pandora opened the box? To which the answer in front of me is very clearly no, right? Pandora opened the box and released them into the world. It was all her fault. And the child looks at me and goes, yes. And I say, oh no, maybe there's a lot more deeper language processing challenges, but I've learned a very good lesson in my career, and it's to always stop. And before you even change the look on your face, is you stop and you ask why. Why do you say, yes, these things existed before? And he looked at me and he said, well, I mean, they were in the box in the first place. How would we have put them in the box and closed the box for her to open it if they didn't exist in the first place? Someone had to put them in the box. And I remember being stunned and looking at him and saying, you're right. This book is wrong. You're right. I cannot argue with this kind of a thinking. And that's the thinking that we often, we, not being dyslexic, we restrict our thinking into boxes very often. Of course, but for him, he saw it in a much bigger picture. And that's something that we can't teach to anybody. And this is something that the world needs as we continue to grow, is that creative, bigger picture thinking that can support them.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's
yeah.
Really interesting to hear. Yeah, I'd love to even delve into that more. But I'm going to switch gears just because it's so unusual for us to have someone coming from a bilingual place,
Yes.
And so we would love to just hear about differences you see, does it seem like there's a difference in prevalence? I mean, in terms of just neurobiology, there wouldn't be, but in terms of maybe how it presents, that could be the case, or are there differences in how to remediate, or just all of it, I guess. Yeah.
It's a very interesting and a very big challenge in this province, to say the least. So imagine in any place where, being dyslexic in a place where we only learn one language is hard enough. Imagine right from the beginning, right from kindergarten, whether you speak English or French at home, you're learning both in this province, right? So having a dyslexic mind, being kind of encountering two similar yet different languages. So in terms of prevalence, they're very similar. So if we're looking at only English or only French, the comparisons are pretty straightforward. We do say that English is a deeper language than French, meaning that there's actually way more spelling and reading patterns in English. Not way more, but significantly enough more in English than there are in French. Especially in reading. Reading in French is supposed to be a little easier than it is in English. I've never seen a child that said that, but anyways, that's supposed to be. However, the difficulty with French is writing it, because then there's a lot of similar sounds that are represented by strings of different kinds of graphemes, different kinds of. So in terms of looking at, if I'm working with a French child who's spoken French at home since the very beginning, and they're now learning French at school, compared to an English child in an English school, no differences. I would say it's the same, and I use the same strategies. I use my visuals, I use my anchors, I use my explicit instruction, and I use my fun, my connection, right? Here's where the difference happens. It's not consecutive, right? It's concurrent. So now you're asking these children to be put in an environment where they have to read two languages and spell two languages that in some cases have graphemes that are exact same, right? And in some cases have letters that are graphemes and phonemes that are completely different, right? Like SH in English makes sh. Well, in French, CH makes sh, right? And to make matters worse, we're not explicitly teaching these rules in the classroom. So we're just expecting them to figure it all out very often, right? That SH makes sh in English and it's CH in French. So when you're asking a student who has difficulty encoding this code in their brain without explicitly teaching them, you're giving them a much bigger reason to despair, a much bigger reason to say, I just can't do this. There's double the code that I need to learn. So really what we need to do is make sure that both in English and in French, we're changing it at the tier 1 level, which is the classroom level, and we're teaching the sound and symbol associations. Then there will be so many of those dyslexic kids that at least start with an idea of learning the code, instead of starting with a simple frustration that not only do I have to do the one thing that I'm not really good at all day, but I have to do it in 2 different codes that I cannot do all day. there's no rhyme or reason to it for them. And that's what I provide. I provide them an explanation as to why symbols say one thing in another and they say something else in another. It's the concurrency that's very hard for these students.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
A few different thoughts floating around in my head here. One question is, do you know if there are any differences, for example, if someone is a native French speaker and say they're growing up in France where they don't have to learn English as early, is dyslexia identified as early in that setting, do you think, as someone who, say, in the US or in a different province of Canada where maybe they don't have to learn French as early, where they are a native English speaker and doing only English in school?
It's an interesting question. And I have a bunch of like studies and research bouncing around in my head that don't necessarily fully answer it. But what I will say is that when you grow up in a bilingual environment where more than one language is present and prevalent, like more than one language is around you at all times, there's a lot of advantages to the brain, really, right? First of all, a student that grows up in a bilingual area will have the notion or understanding that more than one language exists much earlier. So there's research that shows that if you ask a child in Montreal, for example, like which language do we speak, at 4 or 5 years old, they'll be able to say English and French. Like there's two languages or one or the other, but here we speak both. Whereas if you take that same grade and match that child in an English environment, they very often won't even realize they're speaking English because nobody ever sat there and said, oh, we speak in English, but other people speak in other languages, right? So that alone. There's also, I believe the research, and correct me if I'm wrong, but based on I believe the research is between 7 and 9 years old, the brain begins to really prune all the language connections that we are not using, right? So our brain becomes, we're born with open brains, ready to learn and be exposed to any sounds or things, that our brain needs to soak up for us to be able to communicate. As we get older, our brain begins to prune. We get rid of these connections because I don't speak this language. I don't need to know how to make this sound. It's a language that I'll never be interacting with. If you're not, and that's actually a good reason why we have accents. So if we learn a language later in life, when we've already pruned all those connections in our brain, it becomes a lot harder for us to be able to reproduce those sounds. So the exposure to it early is really important because it's opening up our brain to even receive this information in the first place. So if I completely remove you, put you in an English environment completely, only teach you English and then expose you to the French, your brain is going to be lagging in how to soak up another language depending on your age, right? So in a way, it's amazing to have the exposure to two languages. But then when it comes down to really reading and writing there's more of a delay. We always recommend in science of reading to remediate the first language first, which is always what I recommend as well. We're in a reality here where we can't really always do that, right? Like, yes, I will go in and remediate the first language first, but quick behind it, I need to do the other one, whatever it is. I don't have a choice. Your child legally has to be in both languages at school. So it's what we have to do.
Right.
Yeah, and in the US, I think there's a lot of native Spanish speakers who
Exactly.
In school, I don't know that they get the Spanish remediated. They almost certainly get the English remediated first,
Exactly.
which is probably more challenging for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, because it's a second language, right? Yeah. So same thing here when I have, for example, a child who's severely dyslexic, a child who has severe challenges with their ability to read and spell. And if they're not born here, if they didn't have a parent who went to an English school in Montreal, they're forced to go to French school themselves. But if their entire family is English, now we're asking a dyslexic child who's unable to go to an English-speaking school without applying for accommodations and changes from the ministry, and you're asking them to work in a language that's not their own. Those are the children that are going to suffer the most because I can't fix the language I don't know. How am I going to start this, right? That's a big challenge here for sure.
Yeah. But one other thought is I've had a theory. So the two most popular foreign languages to learn in the US are Spanish and French. And I've had a theory that, or I guess we've had a theory that perhaps for an English speaker who's dyslexic, a native English speaker who's dyslexic, Spanish might be easier to learn than French because it's Spanish is such a phonetic language.
Yeah.
And French, while consistent, is very difficult to spell, as you mentioned.
Yes, exactly.
Does that do you agree with that, or do you think that that is
So I don't know enough about Spanish to really confidently say whether it's like a more shallow or more. To me, I speak some Spanish. I'm like a language person, and it feels very phonetic for me. However, once again, we have strings of letters that make new sounds that they don't make in another language. But what I will say, which is very interesting to bring to your point, from my understanding and from some of the research and readings that I've done, there are places such as Japan, for example, where dyslexia is almost non-existent because Japanese is a very, very highly decodable and encodable language where there's just series of consonant and vowels, and the vowels are very consistent in terms of the sounds that they make. And so it's just repetition of consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel over and over and over, which group together to make words and then sentences and so on. So it is my understanding that in places like Japan, although dyslexia does exist, because it's not like, it doesn't mean it can't exist, but it is not prevalent, right, in terms of learning to read and write because of the easier, association between the sounds and symbols, which is very neat to say. So in terms of Spanish, is it possible that that's the case? A little bit, possibly. Maybe it's easier than English and French, but I wouldn't say that it's easy. I would say that a Latin-based language is probably still difficult.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that about Japanese, but that makes
Yeah.
sense when you're saying it. Yeah.
fascinating?
Yeah. There's a few other languages as well it pops up in my, I'm surrounded by so many language kind of learners and facts, and I look into it, and it's absolutely valid. It's interesting to know. It's interesting to know how we are a product of our environments, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true, because that shows the influence between the environment.
Exactly.
Learning. Yeah. Let's see. We just have a few more minutes here, so I'd love to get into some of your, insights and advice and wisdom for different people. Let's start with parents. What advice would you give for parents of dyslexic kids?
The most important, I think, the biggest heartbreaker on my side that I see with parents, and I guess, we say, as you get older, my heart is a little hardened because I've heard this a lot of times, but it's never too late to stop and remediate the language that your child is lacking. So, and I get parents, who call me in tears in grade 6 and say, it's too late. I should have done this in grade 3, and we didn't have the help, and I didn't know, and nobody, and what I always say is, that's the problem, is that nobody knows, right? It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't drop the ball. We were in a place where we didn't really know what to do, and we're emerging out of that, right? It's not too late now to stop and do what we need to do to build the success. And I'll bring you back to, I had a student who was in grade 6 a couple of years ago who was assessed to have a grade 1 reading and writing level. Okay. And I had to fight everybody around me. Everyone was saying, it's too late. It's too late. She's going to high school. We'll give her a computer. It's too late. And I said, no, stop. Give me this child 3 hours a week for 6 months. Just let me do it. And she went from a grade 1 reading and writing level to a grade 4-5 reading, writing level, and ended up winning an award for a short story competition. Like, the amount of things that you can unlock, it's not too late. And then went into high school way more prepared than she had been 6 months before. It's not even too late if you're in high school. It's never too late to stop and do what needs to be done to unlock all of this potential in your child's life.
Yeah, that's really inspiring to hear, and to have an example too, because I think it's true that people do have a sense that of it being too late, and that
shame
prevents it from happening.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, as the parents of a dyslexic kid, I mean, there's always that there's always that sense of like, oh, why didn't we realize this earlier? Like, why did we let her suffer through this year of school when we didn't know what was going on or whatever? And then that interferes, I think, that sense of guilt or whatever interferes with then taking the necessary steps and realizing, okay, like, that's behind us. Let's do the right thing now, and let's just
And the layer of that too is that dyslexia is genetic, right? So very often we have, if it's not the parent, then it's an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, or it came from somewhere. But there's big feelings in the parents as well, right? About like, maybe it was me, maybe, you know, it was my fault. Maybe I remember having a hard time in school, or I remember my brother had a hard time in school and I was so mean to him, and now my kid is like this. So now what do I do? So there's a lot of big feelings, that all of which are very, very valid, but it's never too late to actually stop and fix the problem. No matter what, all those feelings and emotions are super valid, but let's give that child the opportunity to become the best they can be.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. So the next category of people, I guess this is a really big one, the general public who maybe doesn't know, you know, we find that there's still a lot of misconceptions, still a lot of just not knowing about it in general, even though it's so prevalent. So yeah, what would you wish or hope that the general public could know?
That's a big one. We're going to need a whole other hour. One thing was, stop making fun of people who make spelling mistakes. That's a big thing that really bothers me. People who make spelling mistakes may have done 10 times the work you have ever done to learn to read and spell. And if they're still having difficulty, it's likely not their fault, but everybody around them's fault. So don't make fun of people who make spelling mistakes. There's likely very good reasons for that. But really just to recognize that with every deficit is a strength, right? So for the people around us who are struggling in language, these are going to likely be the pivotal people in our society that we will need to depend on to have an improved structure. So, you know, really not, I think we're moving in that direction societally anyways, like to stop judging each other for like how we're different. But we still have some more to go. And certainly, you know, learning that we have so many different kinds of learners and intelligences, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that we all have something to contribute together if we just collaborate. So to be patient, to be understanding, and to be kind to everybody who's different than you.
Yeah.
So important.
Yeah.
A lot of that sounds like good advice for dyslexic kids as well, but I'll add in the final category in case there's something else you want to say for what would your advice be to dyslexic kids?
Oh, definitely, because they're my people, right? These are my students. So the biggest one is don't give up. Over and over and over, I've been given students who are so close to giving up. Like they're like, I'm done. Nobody can teach me this thing that they said they could teach. It's not your fault if you're not learning how to read and write. It's it's everyone around you's fault. And it's not malicious, right? You need to find the person around you who knows how to fix the challenge that you're having. And you can have 100 people who want to help around you, but if they don't know really what to do, that's not on you. Everybody else, we need to learn how you learn to teach you. You don't need to change how you are for us. We need to change how we teach you for you. So don't give up, start over, keep going, because the payoff will be 1,000 times the value of the effort that you put in.
Yeah. It's really important advice. And I feel like your examples can really make it real for them too, because you can point to the fact that, you know, you do make kids successful. So
oh, for sure. And I think when you start to show, like I had a student in grade 4 this year who had been failing English this whole time, and it unlocked, right? And she started reading and writing, and she's a whole new kid, right? Parents are crying, teachers are saying like, you did magic. It's really not even magic. It's not even hard to do what I do. Just sit with me and I can teach you how to do what I do, and everyone will be able to do it. So that's the most important.
That's amazing. Well, we thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
it's amazing and wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So where can people find you online?
Yes. So I have my website, which is pzeducationalconsulting.ca. PZ as in Patricia Zuccala, which is my full name. So pzeducationalconsulting.ca. You can also find me on Facebook and Instagram at PZ Educational Consulting. And you can always shoot me an email, which is Patricia Zuccala, my full name, at pzeducationalconsulting.ca. I do a lot of PD for schools, professional development, program development for schools and teachers. Really, I want to change educators so that students come out on top. So anything that I can do to help in that area.
Great. And we will put those links all in the show notes so that
Perfect.
you can do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much again for this. It
Thank
was
you
wonderful to
both.
hear all about the work you're doing. It's so inspiring.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. I loved your podcast as soon as I found it. I think to have people opening up these discussions is crucial to getting to the next level here. And I want to thank you all for everything that you do. And thank you for having me on your podcast as well. Hopefully we can change a few lives.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.